I should have said social games, because that's the more acceptable word. I won't be able to talk too very much about those because we have limited time. I wanted to first thank the Trent and Oshawa Research Day tradition, because based on the paper I gave a year ago, which was really just on a whim, I was watching my son play open world video games, which I'm going to explain in a minute, and I was intrigued by their realism. And their use of realism, and their use of what were clearly literary tropes and conventions. And so I sat down and started playing them, and then I was horrified by the ideologies, not by the violence, because contemporary literature is violent. And the forms that they were using, the Western, for example, has always been violent. So that didn't shock me. What shocked me was the ideologies that were being reproduced. Specifically after the 2008 collapse, I've noticed that open world games have become much more prevalent. So, what are open world games? Good question, right? These are, sorry, I have a cold, so you're just gonna, actually, I'm gonna put my water. Sorry. Open world games, I'll let you read through that slide yourself. I'm just gonna summarize quickly. And say that open world games, this is where I think they're the most related to realism. And realism is a form of fiction. I call it the most, it's the most prevalent form of fiction. And it creates a very special effect, which is that it can completely immerse a reader into the fictional world. So you probably, what I like to give is, you've probably had this happen to you, where if you read at night, does anybody here read at night? You sit down with a book, and you open it, and then you look up, and it's 2 a.m., and then you start doing the calculations, like, oh my God, how much more sleep can I have? I have to get up at 7. That is the FX of realism, which is you've been brought into, you've left the real time, and you've been brought into the, what's called formally the diegetic universe, but the fictional world that you gain. This is where you are actually a character in a very realistic space. So let me just give you the plot. Now, some of you will have seen this from last year, but I figured we might as well take another look so that I don't have to describe it. It's much more entertaining. Then you can get an idea of the realism of this.
You are the bounty hunter, huh? Your country loves to make trouble at night. Perhaps you come to hunt me, huh? You always did have a high opinion of yourself, John. This is America. A lying, cheating, degenerate, and prosper.
What are you doing now, Mr. Marston?
Yeah, I'm gonna take my time and go after the less kind.
It's gonna be a bloody job.
I don't know, we're gonna change.
This white sabotage cannot be conventionally civilized.
Maybe you live in a different America than we.
Cut you up, piece by piece. Civilization is a truly beautiful thing, Mr. Marston.
Oh, man. Some things is about to get settled once and for all. So it seems.
Yeah, man. 611 housing units in the U.S. in July 2011 was repossessed by the bank or other financial institution. That is a very high rate of foreclosure. And these statistics actually are lowered only by the intervention by federal and state regulation. The real statistics will have yet to come out this year. And these statistics indicate that the American nation and its privileged property-owning citizens have suffered a traumatic wounding. If, as American studies scholars Amy Kaplan, Laura Romero, and Karen Sanchez-Epler theorize, that the American home is a fetishized space, a home front, that encompasses both the familial home and the nation, then the steady rate of foreclosures have materially damaged the structural integrity of the American nation. This multifaceted loss, then, of material and spiritual property, a sublime loss in the stability of exceptionalist ideology, places the American subject in a state of flux between mourning and melancholia. Arguably, the entire nation has been in a continual state of mourning since 9/11, and the collapse has encouraged this perennial mourning, which is a pathological state, much like melancholia, that can afflict a national group, and this is according to Volkin, who's a psychologist. He writes that entire social groups can be invested with what are called entitlement ideologies, through which certain cultural groups will violently try to mitigate the loss they've suffered by taking back what they feel is rightfully theirs. What is interesting, though, is that in the United States, that really hasn't happened. So the question is then, why do the majority of Americans, save for perhaps this somewhat nonviolent Occupy and Tea Party movements, passively, really mostly passively, accept foreclosures, job loss, and economic disparity? Now, in the book I'm writing that's come out of the paper I gave at Trent Research Day last year, I then gave a paper at an international conference that garnered a lot of attention. I have a chapter that's coming out in the summer in a journal. A lot of people are very interested in this idea. I think because open world games are explaining a lot of why, are part of the function of why people are not responding in the way they should. The disparity indexes in the human development, the statistics, sorry, the disparity in the human development index, in the United States, there's been a 25% increase between the rich and the poor. The middle class is being wiped out, basically. So why aren't they fighting, despite national entrenched promises of entitlement to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? And I argue that the high tolerance for inequality and loss, even loss of homes, one of the prime symbols of national stability and privileged identity, can be linked in part to the idea that the strenuous life, this is a common discourse in American culture, the strenuous life, replete with suffering, is a necessary part of fulfilling normative American identity. On the digital frontier then, Red Dead Redemption, which I'm going to say RDR from now on, resuscitates white, middle-class heteronormative identity in the form of those who own small ranching operations and homesteads. And through these representations, teach its players that suffering, loss, and rapid technological change are simply part of life. You just have to deal with it. It's just part of life. RDR naturalizes and therefore depoliticizes the economic downturn. And this digitized frontier, I have a lot more statistics. I just don't have time to show them, but if you're interested, do email me. This about the disparity that's going on in the US right now. For example, I'll just intervene just a second to say that the United States, as far as I know, does not provide multi-level poverty indexes to the UN, which skews where they stand in the human development rankings. Okay? So this digitized frontier then operates as a safety valve for the pressures brought to bear on American citizenry by the continued repercussions of the 2008 collapse. And so what happens then is that this game operates as a kind of 21st century safety valve that relieves the pressures of a failed neoliberal economy. And this is because the participatory nature of the video game offers stability for the player, ontological and epistemic stability, to be exact. This video game engages the player on multiple levels. As a performer, a reader, and a viewer, we must decode the game's fictional universe in order to progress through the game. And so if you can decode each mission, which is called a chapter in this particular game, each mission or plot conflict successfully, then you can move to another mission and become one step closer to the climax of the story. And in each of these plots, the player, as Marston, must, if necessary, violently defend the edicts of neoliberalism. So RDR, therefore, is not simply fulfilling a nostalgic dream of American identity through the was or the past of the West, but operates as a cultural placeholder of authenticity. And it does this through immersive storytelling and performativity. So what's interesting about humans, among many things, is that there's really no simple distinction between really doing and being and not really doing or being, which is why we can pretend, which is called imagination, right? So a performer to play, for example, may be asked to read a newspaper as part of a performance, but if the actor really reads the newspaper, has he or she stopped performing? So therefore, when a player, male or female, takes on the masculine role of John Marston, he or she is highly susceptible through that immersion to the ideologies at play, so to speak, in RDR. Okay, so let's just watch it. This is actually Bonnie Marston, and she is a ranch owner. She actually runs the ranch. Her father owns all the property. She's kidnapped, and so we'll just see that there is some foul language here, just warning.
I don't have a clue. All right, it's got to be something to do with that government boy. We'll talk to him, find out what he knows. Fucking answer.
I want Norman to think. I want him set free. Then you get your daughter back, mister.
We don't do deals with outlaws, boy.
Yeah, you do. Let's not waste each other's time pretending otherwise. All government themselves ain't much more than a bunch of crooks. This is a land of opportunity, mister. And I'm giving you the opportunity to get your daughter back before 15 friends of mine take on all their anger and their loneliness.
If you want to know the rest, you're going to have to play the game. Okay, so in the video then you saw the outlaw attack Central American values. He says, this is the land of opportunity. He says the government is corrupt, and there's a lot of sardonic quipping about American values and their corruption. The Marshal, John Marston, Mr. McFarland, Bonnie, they're all hostile towards the government and the promises of the nation, but they obey. This is one of the shifts in the Western genre. That's a key element to the game. So it enforces neoliberalism by saying, yeah, things have gone terribly awry, the government's corrupt, deals are made with outlaws and so on, but it's all we've got. This is all we've got. We've got to work for it. This is where eternal inequality reigns, right? Because RDR incorporates performativity into its narrative matrix. And I've got to outline what neoliberalism is, but I want to make sure Leah has enough time. But basically, RDR can create an immersive experience for the player that is not akin to reading. This is a new kind of literacy. A literacy that places responsibility for fractures in property and ownership onto the shoulders of rustlers and individuals rather than corporate interests. At the end of the day, both the law, in the form of Marshall Johnson, and the anti-hero or the bounty hunter or outlaw, Marston, work for corporate interests and the government that supports corporate interests, respectively. Now this really reflects, in the rest of the book I talk about the ways in which this is parallel, not exactly like, but parallel to the progressive era in the US, where the rampant greed was the name of the game, was the order of the day. And this actually, some of the history in here, if you're interested, has to do with the Johnson County Wars. So if you want to talk to me about that after, we can talk about that. But this is part of a real historical, these are some real historical events that happens, and that's also part of the Western genre, as a revising of that history. In any case, both Marston and the Marshal may complain about their employers, but they do what they're told to support ideologies of property and ownership. So that's one chapter of the book, and the rest we'll be talking about Borderland games, with which Red Dead Redemption is one. Call of Juarez is another. It's very disturbing. Juarez is actually a real place. It's across the border from El Paso. And there's representations of Hispanic identity here that really supports or continues to support white supremacy and cultural superiority. There's also representations of indigenous identity, and these racialized stereotypes really support neocolonialism. Now, I know this is going to make you laugh, but I laughed at first too, the next slide, but I find it very disturbing. This is a game that you play on Facebook. These are called social media games. Do you want to know how many people play this game? Try 9 million. 9 million. And this is a game where you conquer the land and you dig up indigenous artifacts and you sell them. And you have to gain the respect of the Wikiwa tribe. And so the indigenous regalia is used, and you win the regalia and you can possess it and own it. The main point though is to capture the land. The main players of a game like this is actually middle-class, middle-aged white women. They play for about 46 hours a day. So that's going to be comprise the rest of the book. I really think that these are important. They really incorporate a lot of literary tropes and conventions that further an idea of America that actually took a long time to change and is now coming back to haunt, I would say. And that would be this really neoliberal, white supremacist version of the United States. Okay, so now Leah's going to talk about LA Noire. I'm just going to show you a trailer. And I talk about this in my book as well, but Leah's got a great take on it.
Takes a certain animal cunning, man. Do you think he might be ready for it?
It's pretty
LAPD, could you stay clear of the body, please? You look smooth, fellas.
Never gets any easier than cops.
The wallet by the car. Was there anything in it?
You deny owning a pistol.
I owned a gun, yes, but it was stolen in a burglary a couple years ago.
Tell me what I want to know. Bravo, half the LAPD down here tearing this place apart. Lying to me, and I'll have you charged in front of the grand jury before your feet touch the ground.
I bought the car, and I've got the paperwork to prove it. Remember there was a time for extracting a confession. This was it.
You knew the car was dirty.
He has a way of proving that, son. We had a goddamn arrangement! I was able to bring no less than 3 suspects in my station and still managed to charge the wrong guy. I did it for you, and that's how you repay me! You needed the money, so you killed her. That's not true, goddammit! Rouse them, beat them, restore some fairness in the police work.
This is how a good detective operates. You keep digging and asking questions until you get to the truth.
I'll just leave the picture up for you there.
All right.
There we go.
Okay, so that's LA Noire. Now, unlike Sarah, I'm actually pretty optimistic about video games, although I do agree that some, like Call of Juarez and Pioneer Trail, I think it's called, are pretty indefensible. Okay, I self-identify as a gamer the same way I self-identify as a reader. Not as a badge of membership, but as a deep appreciation for what I consider to be a very versatile medium. So when in Sarah's American Literature course I was offered the chance to play and analyze LA Noire as my final project, I jumped on that like it was made of diamonds. Since then, I've been playing the game, taking down notes, or more accurately, my boyfriend's been taking down notes because I'm playing, taking screenshots and then writing about it later in my blog. Here's just one of the things I've learned. LA Noire is actually a very rich narrative, painted with the aesthetics and literary stylings of the noir genre, but with whole new narrative tools because of the medium change. And every other Rockstar game I've played, and Red Dead Redemption is a Rockstar game, and so is the very infamous Grand Theft Auto series, the protagonist is a criminal of some sort, and you spend a good chunk of your time avoiding the authorities and the cops. In this game, you are the authorities. You play as Cole Phelps, an ex-World War II Marine turned law enforcement poster boy in the year 1947. He is our hard-boiled detective, if you couldn't tell by looking at him, a post-industrial frontiersman, a practical necessity of any story that calls itself noir. Other noir tropes present in the game are the femme fatale, corrupt authority figures, visual use of shadows, and a deeply flawed social order. That last point is something Cole is very keenly aware of, and like most noir detectives, he resists that social order, in his case with sheer but muted optimism. He wants to believe in a better America, even when all evidence points to the contrary. Now, those factors of noir are all there, but they in themselves are not enough to make the game a true example of the form. One criticism that gets lobbed at games all the time is the apparent superficiality of their genre markers. These critics say, that game looks like a Western, and it looks like a noir, but they're just interesting backdrops to a slew of gameplay sequences indistinguishable from one another. Because it is a game, and they always say game as if it were synonymous with toy, you can't actually delve into the issues of these genres in any meaningful or complex way. To do so would be to sacrifice the interactivity of the player. Needless to say, I disagree. Video games tell their stories through interactivity, not in spite of it. By paying attention to what the player can and cannot control in the story, you can actually gain insight to narrative cogs at work. To illustrate this point, I will exemplify the game's presentation of Cole's family life, or rather, the lack of presentation. You have to understand, this game is extremely detail-oriented, and very open, and very free. We see every moment of Cole's various investigations. Through him, I've checked out like hundreds of pieces of litter that he wants to look at for his investigation. I've read dozens of letters, and if I were so inclined, I could just get out of my car and wander around the city aimlessly and walk inside complete strangers' houses. But I'm nearly finished the story, and I haven't actually seen the inside of Cole's house. I haven't met his daughters. I have seen his wife, twice, and very briefly. But I don't think this means that his family is unimportant to the story. I think this means that their importance is unsaid. And it's worth noting here that while I was playing, I decided to read Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon at the same time, for comparison's sake. In that story, too, many important things are left unsaid. We never really get any illumination of what Hammett's protagonist, Sam Spade, is thinking, for example, but we do get long, in-depth descriptions of apparently meaningless actions like rolling a cigarette or pouring a drink, literally for paragraphs on end. It is only when you notice that these long bodily descriptions occur at moments of stress, like when Sam discovers his partner has been murdered, that you realize the omniscient narrator has been giving you clues into his mental state the whole time. So it goes with Cole's family. You may assume they are remote because of relevance, but we actually learned it's because Cole is remote from them. Emotionally distant, he refers to his wife only as the mother of my children, and prefers not to speak of them. He also prefers not to speak of his time in the war, if that tells you anything. When we finally do get to see his wife, we see exactly how much damage has been done. She's discovered he's been having an affair and throws him out of the house. And that same principle applies throughout the entire game. Through interactivity and contrasting non-interactivity, I have learned Cole's stances on racial tensions, violence against women, and the social order. I have learned that he prefers to see the world in black and white and operates to the letter of the law to maintain that unambiguous vision. I have learned that although he hides it remarkably well, he is in fact quite wounded. His family life is part of that, as all noir detectives must be to differentiate them from the more classical Sherlock Holmes type. At the end of the day, Sherlock can always go back to Baker Street and play his fiddle some more. Cole has no such luxury, partially because he got kicked out. Finally, there's the world of LA Noir itself. The America we see in-game is a country that is struggling to recover from war. It is seeing increased violence against women, exploitation of so-called minorities, etc. But all of this is naturalized within the world to the point that all the other characters, the majority of them cynics or even outright crooks, negotiate these symbolic orders rather than challenge them. Cole resists negotiating because negotiation does not fit within his black-white view of the world, but ultimately he always gives in, if reluctantly. For all his talk about upholding the law, and he talks about it a lot, he loves to chastise people, he is not willing to risk his own position in the social order. He, too, is tied up in it. But I actually think something metatextual is going on here. When Cole resists these social orders, what he is covertly doing is establishing official values between him and the player. After all, we play as Cole, his triumphs are ours, so naturally we're going to almost always automatically agree with him. But the values he posits are actually much more in line with common thinking now, in 2012, rather than most perspectives in the 1940s. I think that this happens to reaffirm these values in the minds of the player, who may not even notice. And because the contrast between Cole's words and the behavior of everyone around him is so stark, the former will almost always look preferable in comparison. This is forced perspective, and it can be very dangerous, hard to recognize when one is immersed in the game world. And it's something to be aware of when you are playing, especially if you're playing Call of Juarez, or Red Dead Redemption, or Pioneer Trail. My project playing and analyzing LA Noir is still ongoing. I'm near the end of the game, but I have a lot of writing to do about it over the summer. I look forward to seeing what else the game has to offer, both as a story in general and as a piece of interactive noir fiction. Thank you.